At an upscale jewelry store in Riverton, an eager young black teenager walked in looking for the perfect gift for his sister. But as soon as the glass door closed behind him, his joy was quickly replaced by the scrutinizing gaze of the manager. When he accidentally dropped a silver bracelet onto the floor, the suspicion immediately turned into a baseless accusation. Just minutes later, the police arrived, believing the accusation without verification, ready to handcuff him without asking a single question. What they didn't know was that this boy wasn't alone. His father was one of the most powerful men they had ever encountered, and he was about to turn the tables in a way no one expected. The late afternoon sunlight bathed the downtown streets of Riverton, reflecting off the modern glass buildings and high-end stores. The streets were bustling with well-dressed people, carrying designer bags as they stepped out from luxury shops. In the midst of this opulence stood 17-year-old Jordan Carter, in front of Westworth Jewelers, a store known for its sparkling jewelry priced at the equivalent of a month's wages for working-class families. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his wallet in his jacket pocket, which held the money he had saved over the past few months. Today was an important day. His sister Maya was about to turn 14. Jordan had been working extra hours after school at Parker's Coffee House, diligently wiping tables, making drinks, and accepting small tips. All of this effort was for one thing. This silver bracelet he had been dreaming of for so long, the one he was sure would make Maya burst with happiness. The image of her holding out her wrist, eyes sparkling as she looked at the shiny bracelet, made Jordan smile. He stepped forward and pushed open the heavy glass door, the bell above ringing to signal the arrival of a new customer. But as soon as he entered, the atmosphere in the store changed instantly. Gone was the warmth of the sparkling lights and the luxurious scent of perfume that had filled the air. Instead, Jordan felt a cold, invisible chill sweeping over him. Behind the display counter of expensive jewelry stood Margaret Whitmore, the store manager. A middle-aged woman with blonde hair, sharp features, and the cold eyes of someone who was all too familiar with judging others. At first, her gaze was a fleeting glance, indifferent. But the moment she recognized who Jordan was, her expression shifted. From indifferent to suspicious. From suspicious to wary. She straightened her back, her hands instinctively gripping the counter. Her eyes quickly scanned Jordan's unzipped hoodie, his jeans, and sneakers. Her lips tightened. Her eyes clearly held a familiar, unspoken question. What is he doing here? Margaret's stare didn't skim over casually, but was full of deliberation, scrutiny, as though she were searching for a sign, even the smallest one, to confirm the thoughts in her head. It wasn't the gaze of a salesperson welcoming a customer, but that of a gatekeeper, someone who believed they had the right to decide who deserved to be here and who didn't. Jordan was all too familiar with that gaze. He had seen it at the supermarket when an older woman clutched her purse tighter as he walked past. He had seen it in the parking lot when a security guard silently followed him for a long stretch of road just because he was waiting for a friend. And now, it was right in front of him, in the cold, sharp eyes of Margaret Whitmore. She didn't look at him as a customer, but as an intruder, someone who was to be suspected simply for being present. Jordan took a deep breath, keeping calm. He had nothing to fear, nothing to hide. He just wanted to buy a gift for his sister, that was all. But Margaret didn't think so. She slowly crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes as her voice spoke, cold and full of doubt. Are you sure you want to buy this bracelet? The simple words carried a deeper meaning. It wasn't a regular question, but a challenge. A suggestion that Jordan shouldn't be here, that he wasn't worthy of owning what he was pointing at. Jordan didn't flinch. He was used to having to prove his worth even in the most mundane situations. He kept his tone calm, neither high nor low, but clear. "Yes, ma'am, I've saved enough money." He slowly took out his wallet, carefully opening it, making sure not to make any gestures that could be misinterpreted. Inside were neatly stacked bills, money he had worked hard to earn. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She stared at the money in his hand, but instead of the typical response of a salesperson seeing a customer able to pay, she pursed her lips, her eyes shining with an even clearer skepticism. A smirk appeared, a smile, not of friendliness but of contempt hidden behind a false appearance. "Oh, so where did this money come from?" she asked. The question was spoken with deliberate unmasking. Her voice was soft, but as sharp as a cold blade. It wasn't simply a question, it was a veiled accusation. An accusation that needed no evidence, no reasoning. Just the presence of Jordan was enough for Margaret to conclude. Jordan felt a simmering anger rising in his chest, but he held it back. He knew the only way to deal with people like Margaret wasn't with fierce resistance, but with steadfastness, calmness, and not giving them a reason to force him into the mold they had already set. He looked Margaret squarely in the eye, keeping his voice calm but clearly articulating every word. "I work at Parker's Coffee House. I've saved every penny over months to buy this bracelet for my sister." The words came out with firm conviction, but in Margaret's eyes he could see she didn't believe a word of it. She snorted lightly, as though hearing a far-fetched story. "Really?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharpening as she scanned Jordan's face, as if searching for any sign that he was lying. Her hand tapped rhythmically on the glass counter, an unconscious action but one that clearly reflected her inherent suspicion. A moment passed, then Margaret squinted, as if a thought had occurred to her. "You said you work at Parker's Coffee?" She emphasized the question. "Does that place pay enough to buy things here?" This time, Jordan could clearly hear the mockery in her voice. She didn't need to know the truth, because for her, the truth didn't matter as much as the preconceptions in her mind. A black boy working at a small coffee shop, walking into an upscale store with a stack of cash. She had already formed her own answer. He wasn't unfamiliar with how people looked at him this way, but this time it stung more, because he simply wanted to buy a gift for his sister, yet even that was being doubted and judged. Jordan stood firm. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, "and I want to buy that bracelet right now." Margaret was silent for a few seconds, then she chuckled lightly, a smile with no joy. "Is that so?" Then, instead of pulling out the bracelet, she subtly leaned toward the phone on the counter. A small movement, but full of implication. Jordan saw it. A cold sensation ran down his spine. She didn't care if he had the money or not. She had already made her decision the moment he walked into the store. And at that moment, Jordan realized a bitter truth. Money couldn't buy the trust of those who had already decided not to trust him from the start. The atmosphere inside the jewelry store suddenly became heavy, as if the air around had been sucked dry. The scent of expensive perfume, the sparkling light from the diamonds in the display case, all seemed to fade into the background as tension slowly enveloped the room. Jordan took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He was used to conversations like this, where every answer he gave wasn't truly listened to, but was just a test to see if he would lie. A test that people like him always fail, not because they do something wrong, but because from the very beginning they are seen as guilty. "I work at Parker's Coffee House. I've saved up every penny to buy this bracelet for my sister." He kept his tone steady, emphasizing each word to avoid any misunderstandings. But as soon as he finished speaking, Margaret chuckled. A soft laugh, but it held no joy. She tilted her head, her eyes filled with doubt and a hint of amusement, as if she had just heard a naive, laughable story. "Oh, really?" Her voice dragged on, deliberately emphasizing the sarcasm. Then, without waiting for Jordan to speak further, she shook her head, clicking her tongue slightly as if expressing fake sympathy for him. "You must have found it on the street, right, or—" She paused briefly, her eyes narrowing with calculation. Someone must have forgotten it. The words were like a sharp knife, stabbing straight into Jordan's pride. He felt heat rising on his face, but not from embarrassment, rather from anger. Not just because she didn't believe him, but because she had already decided that no matter what the truth was, it didn't matter. Because in her mind, Jordan could not have earned enough to buy this legitimately. He clenched his fist, but tried to keep his voice steady. "I didn't pick it up. I didn't take it from anyone. I earned this money myself." This time, his voice wasn't as soft as before, but stronger, as if to prove he wasn't a child who could be looked down upon. But Margaret was unfazed. She looked him straight in the eye, then glanced at the stack of cash on the counter, as if she saw something filthy that she didn't want to touch. "Ah, of course," she said, her voice sickly sweet but laced with mockery. Then she took a deep breath, as though trying to suppress a laugh, before turning to a nearby employee, a young woman with curly brown hair, neatly dressed in uniform. "Rebecca, do you believe that a boy working at a coffee shop could make enough money to buy a piece of jewelry from Westworth?" Rebecca hesitated, her gaze flickering quickly between Jordan and her manager. She didn't dare to disagree, but also didn't dare to agree. I don't know," she replied softly, quickly bowing her head and pretending to rearrange the rings in the display case. Margaret chuckled. "I thought so," she said, then turned back to Jordan, her eyes like a predator who had scented blood. The tension in the air thickened. Jordan could feel the eyes of everyone around him. An elderly couple standing nearby took a small step back, as though just being near him might put them in danger. A middle-aged woman in a light blue floral dress, carrying a designer handbag, quietly pulled her bag closer to her body. He could hear the quiet whispers, feel the eyes filled with half surprise, half concern, with the rest just a confirmation of their pre-existing prejudices. They all had the answer in their heads, even though Jordan hadn't done anything wrong. Jordan tightened his grip on the handle of his purse, his heart pounding faster. He didn't want to be here for another second, but he couldn't leave without buying the bracelet. Because if he left now, they would think they were right. He took a deep breath, staring straight at Margaret. "I want to buy the bracelet, right now." The words were not just a request, they were a statement, a challenge, a defiance of the skeptical eyes that were fixed on him. But Margaret wasn't going to make it that easy. She subtly leaned forward, her hand gently reaching for the phone on the counter. A small gesture, but it was full of implications. "I think it's better if we check a bit before making the sale, don't you think?" She hadn't picked up the phone yet, but the intention was already clear. Jordan felt a shiver run down his spine. He understood what was about to happen. Margaret didn't need proof. She didn't need a real reason to doubt him. She just needed an excuse, and right now she had found it. Margaret kept her hand on the counter, her bony fingers gently tapping the glass, as if she were considering something. Jordan could clearly see the brief struggle in her eyes, not because she was unsure whether to trust him, but because she was debating whether or not to sell him the bracelet. Finally, with a fake sigh, Margaret reluctantly opened the display case, as though she was giving in to something she found absurd. She slowly lifted the silver bracelet from the velvet lining, placing it on the counter with an exaggerated flourish. as if putting something priceless into the hands of someone undeserving. "Be careful," she said, her tone laden with meaning, emphasizing each word deliberately. "It's worth more than 5 times your salary." The words felt like an invisible slap to Jordan's self-esteem. He gripped the handle of his wallet tightly, holding back the anger rising in his chest. It wasn't because those words hurt him. They didn't anymore, but because they were all too familiar. Words like that no longer surprised him, but they still hurt, in a slow and cold way. Jordan swallowed the frustration, reaching out to take the bracelet. The cool, shiny silver felt cold under his fingertips, a small piece of jewelry that held so much meaning. He had worked hard for it. He had imagined Maya's beaming face when she wore it on her tiny wrist. But just as he turned the bracelet slightly to admire it in the light, it slipped from his hand. A moment of frozen silence. Jordan lunged forward in panic, but it was too late. The bracelet hit the glass counter with a small, sharp clink, like a knife cutting through the tense air. From the glass, it bounced and fell onto the marble floor with a chilling clang that echoed through the store. The whole space seemed to freeze for a brief second. Then, Margaret's scream shattered the silence. "I knew it." Her voice was shrill, full of fake excitement but too dramatic to be a natural reaction. "He's trying to steal it." She pointed a finger directly at Jordan, her eyes blazing with something more than anger. There was satisfaction there, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for. Jordan stood frozen. His heart pounded in his chest. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, the worst thing he feared happened. The eyes of the store immediately turned to look at him. Nervous, judgmental glances, filled with doubt. A woman in a blue silk dress gasped, instinctively taking a step back, as if Jordan were an actual threat. An elderly man in a gray suit, holding a Rolex, shook his head with a frown, not in surprise, but as if he had just seen something he had always expected. No one needed to verify the truth. No one questioned whether Jordan was really trying to steal anything. All they saw was a black teenager standing in a high-end store, accused by a white woman yelling at him. And that was enough. They had their answer. Jordan felt his breath quicken, his chest tightening. No, not like this. Before he could bend down to pick up the bracelet, before he could explain himself, Margaret was already reaching for the phone on the counter. Her finger dialed so quickly that Jordan couldn't help but think she was used to doing this. "Call the police right now." Her voice was growing louder, as if she were making sure everyone in the store could hear. "We have a thief." Black teenager, hoodie, trying to run away. Her last words were almost like a curse. Jordan hadn't run, hadn't even thought about fleeing, but Margaret had crafted the perfect story to make him look guilty. Right then, he heard a sound even scarier than Margaret's scream. The distant wail of a siren. A chill ran down Jordan's spine. No, this can't be happening. But the truth stood before him, unyielding. The police were on their way, and this time, Jordan knew. One wrong move. It could all end in a way he never wanted to imagine. Margaret grabbed the phone, her fingers dialing the number quickly yet with certainty, as if she were accustomed to this procedure. Her voice rose, sharp and clear, no longer laced with sarcasm or suspicion, but with a commanding accusation, a sentence delivered without the need for a judge or jury. "Call the police right now. We have a thief, a young black man in a hoodie trying to run away." Her words hit like a direct blow to reality. Jordan stood still, not running, making no suspicious movements, but that no longer mattered. What had just been said by Margaret carried more weight than the truth itself, because when someone like her spoke, others wouldn't need verification before believing her. The atmosphere in the store shifted immediately. Wealthy customers, some startled, others quietly stepping back, as though even standing near him could get them implicated. A woman in a floral dress pulled her handbag closer to her body, and a middle-aged man in an expensive suit shook his head with a disappointed look, not in surprise, but as though he had already expected this to happen. No one asked what had really happened. No one looked at the ring still lying on the floor, which Jordan hadn't had time to pick up. They just stared at him, at the image of a young black teenager standing in the middle of a luxury store with an accusing gaze from a white woman, and that was enough for them to have their answer. What Jordan feared most had come true. The sirens wailed from afar, at first faint but quickly growing louder, like a nightmare approaching that he couldn't escape from. Westworth Jewelers was now filled with flashing police lights reflecting off the shiny glass surfaces. The glass door was shoved open, and two officers rushed in with the certainty of those who had already made up their minds. Sergeant Blake entered first, a middle-aged man with a muscular build, short, graying hair, and the cold face of someone who had been doing this job long enough not to care about excuses. He didn't need to know what had happened, because hearing the description on the radio, young black man, hoodie, suspected of theft, he already knew what to do. Behind him was Officer Doyle, younger, his eyes quickly scanning the scene, a hint of hesitation but still professional as he stood beside his superior. Jordan didn't have time to say anything, didn't get a chance to explain, didn't get to do anything before Blake's deep, authoritative voice filled the air. "Hands up now." The words hit like a sentence being pronounced directly to his face. Jordan couldn't believe his ears. He hadn't touched the ring, hadn't made any suspicious movement, hadn't planned to leave the store, yet he was being treated like a criminal. Margaret continued her act, as if her initial accusation wasn't strong enough to completely destroy him. "I caught him trying to stuff the ring into his pocket." Her voice trembled, not out of fear, but in an attempt to appear frightened, like an innocent witness threatened by a villain. "I saw it. Clearly, he was about to run as soon as I turned my back." Jordan felt like he was burning up inside. He wanted to scream, to refute, to tell everyone in the room that they were wrong, that they were being led astray by an outrageous lie. But he knew, no matter what he said, his words wouldn't carry the weight of Margaret's. Blake moved closer, his hand resting on the handcuffs at his belt. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jordan snapped, unable to hold it in any longer. Blake paused for a brief moment but then shook his head, his eyes hard, the gaze of someone who had long since stopped caring about denials. "I'm not asking if you did something wrong. I'm telling you to raise your hands right now." His voice was as firm as steel, with no trace of patience. Doyle stayed behind, not pulling out his cuffs, not moving forward like Blake. He kept his distance, his eyes flicking between Jordan and Margaret to the silver ring still lying on the floor. There was something in his eyes, a tiny hint of hesitation, but it wasn't enough to stop what was happening. Jordan's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might explode. He glanced around the store, looking at the faces that observed him with cold detachment, at Blake's gaze that had no hesitation. He understood that if he made any mistake, just one wrong move, a hand raised too quickly, it could all end in a way he never wanted to imagine. Taking a deep breath, he held his gaze steady, slowly pulling his phone out of his pocket. Not too fast, not sudden. He dialed the number and brought the phone to his ear. A familiar voice answered on the other end. "Dad, I need you to come to Westworth Jewelers right now." The atmosphere in the store shifted suddenly. Margaret stopped breathing for a moment, Doyle raised an eyebrow, and Blake frowned, a clear sign of irritation. No one knew who Jordan had just called, but in that instant, he could feel an invisible shift in the balance of power. He didn't beg, he didn't panic, he didn't try to run. He simply made a phone call, and somehow, that was enough to make everyone in the store pay attention. And in that moment, Jordan knew this story was far from over. Less than a second after Jordan hung up, Blake swiftly pulled the handcuffs from his belt with a decisive motion. No need to confirm the accusation, no need to examine the evidence, no need to ask questions. "Hands up now!" His voice rang out, deep and as hard as steel, leaving no room for debate. Jordan stood frozen, his heart pounding as if it wanted to leap out of his chest. The air in the store grew thick, heavy, suffocating, and it seemed like every other sound vanished, leaving only Blake's dry command and Jordan's rapid breath. "I didn't do anything," Jordan shouted, his voice a mix of frustration and desperation, yet still maintaining the calm he had learned over years of facing situations like this. Margaret didn't stop. On the contrary, she gained momentum, her voice growing more frantic and dramatic, as if the presence of the police had empowered her. "He's hiding the ring. I can see it clearly." Her gaze burned, as if she had caught Jordan red-handed. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling slightly, as though she had just escaped a deadly situation, even though she was still safely behind the counter, at least a meter away from him. She didn't say, "I think he's hiding the ring," nor did she say, "I suspect." She was certain, declaring, "I can see it clearly," as though what she had imagined in her head had become an undeniable truth. Jordan felt his blood boil. He hadn't touched the ring, hadn't stuffed anything in his pocket, but Margaret's words carried more weight than his actual actions. A few customers in the store began to whisper. A man near the counter shook his head slightly, while a woman in a floral dress hugged her purse tightly, as if afraid Jordan would snatch it away at any moment. Doyle, the younger officer, hesitated briefly, his gaze flicking quickly from Jordan to Margaret, then to Blake. Something wasn't right. Doyle had heard enough of these kinds of stories. Incidents that seemed simple, but were often more complicated than they appeared. His instincts told him not to rush into action, that they should reassess the situation before doing anything irreversible. But before Doyle could speak, Blake stepped forward, still holding the handcuffs, as if arresting Jordan was a foregone conclusion. "Turn around now." His voice was no longer a command, but a declaration of absolute authority, an announcement that from this moment on, Jordan's words no longer mattered. Jordan looked Blake straight in the eye, trying to find any sign of hesitation, any indication that maybe he would listen, but in the man's gaze there was only cold resolve. No doubt, no question, no hesitation. Everything had already been decided. Jordan took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but every muscle in his body was tense. He knew he couldn't resist, couldn't make any movements that could be misinterpreted, because if he did, the story would spiral out of control. But he also knew that if Blake handcuffed him, everything would end in an even worse way. He clenched his teeth, feeling each heavy heartbeat in his chest. He couldn't let that happen, and that was when the glass door of the store opened for the second time. Jordan didn't need to look back to know who had just entered. It wasn't a customer, it wasn't a staff member, it wasn't a stranger. It was someone who could make the entire room fall silent immediately, someone who could change the entire course of the situation with just a glance. Doyle blinked, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Blake froze, still gripping the handcuffs, but he hadn't clicked them shut. And Margaret went pale, her complexion shifting so quickly that it seemed as though she had just seen a nightmare step out of reality. From the doorway, a deep voice rang out. Not loud, not hurried, but carrying more weight than any command Blake had ever issued. "I suggest you stop immediately." The entire room fell into an absolute silence. Blake turned his head, and as soon as his eyes met the man who had just entered, his shoulders stiffened in a way Jordan had never seen before. A tall man, dressed in a neat navy polo, his posture straight as if his entire body were made of steel, his sharp eyes carrying a terrifying determination, as if he could see through the thoughts of those standing before him. No one spoke. No one dared to step forward. Because the man who had entered the Westworth Jewelers store was Captain Marcus Carter, commander of an elite Navy SEAL unit. And this was not a man Blake could command, not a man Margaret could manipulate, not a man who would stand by and watch his son be treated like a criminal without just cause. Jordan felt his chest swell, trying to take a deep breath to regain his composure. He was still trapped in this situation. But he knew everything had changed completely. The atmosphere in the store froze the moment the man walked in. No one moved, no one spoke, no one dared to breathe too loudly. The noise from moments before, accusations, sirens, the chaos of an arrest, suddenly quieted into an eerie silence, but one that was heavy with weight. Blake still held the handcuffs tightly, but he had not locked them. His entire body was rigid, not from fear, but because he realized the situation had just changed in a way he had not anticipated. Marcus Carter, the man who had just entered the store, didn't need to raise his voice to command everyone's attention. He didn't need to shout to take control. He simply stood there, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room, making the innocent feel protected and the guilty feel exposed. Blake took a second to steady himself, but it was a second too long for a police officer used to making decisions on the spot. He clenched his jaw as if reminding himself that he was still in charge of the situation, that he was the one who had the authority here. "And who are you?" Blake's voice rang out, challenging, but with an unmistakable hint of tension. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He walked calmly towards Jordan, unflinching, unhurried, but with every step the ground beneath seemed to solidify. Jordan hadn't spoken since his father appeared. He didn't need to. He stood still, feeling the weight of that presence, of someone he knew would never let him be pulled into an unjust situation without fighting for him. Marcus didn't look at Blake right away. He just glanced over at his son, as if making sure he was okay. When his eyes met the handcuffs dangling in Blake's hand, a cold glint flashed in his usually calm eyes. That was when he spoke. "Marcus Carter, Captain of the SEAL Team, United States Navy." The room became tense in an entirely different way. Doyle, still standing behind, immediately straightened. His expression shifted from hesitation to full awareness of the gravity of the situation. Blake, though trying to maintain his composure, gritted his teeth in a way Jordan knew well. A man like Blake wasn't used to being put on the defensive, not used to facing someone he couldn't threaten. Margaret, who had remained silent since Marcus entered, suddenly felt uncertain about her control over the situation. She swallowed hard, trying to regain her confidence, but her hands instinctively clenched the edge of the counter as if trying to hold on to a reality that was slipping out of her grasp. Blake squinted. "So," he called his father, "and you think that just because you're a Special Forces soldier that means we can't do our jobs?" Marcus didn't react right away. He stood firm, his eyes still locked on Blake, as if assessing whether this man truly understood the storm he was about to face. "Your job?" Marcus spoke slowly, but with undeniable authority. "What exactly is your job, Sergeant Blake? Is it to barge into a store without checking for evidence? Is it to try and arrest a boy without asking a single question? Or is it to believe the unfounded accusations of someone you haven't even verified? Blake blinked, but said nothing. Marcus took a step forward. My job, he continued, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of invisible menace, is to face situations 100 times more dangerous than this. It's to protect justice, and I can tell you right now, what you're doing is not justice. Blake clenched his fists. His eyes filled with tension as he realized he no longer had control of the situation. Jordan watched all of this, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a confrontation between a police officer and a father. This was a battle of principles, of power, of truth. Margaret, now realizing everything wasn't going according to her plan, tried to intervene. I'm just doing what's right, she said, her voice much smaller than before. I saw him acting suspiciously. I couldn't let him steal and walk away. Marcus turned to face her, his eyes locking onto hers, causing her to freeze instantly. I'll give you a chance, he said, his voice low but threatening. Do you want to repeat what you just said? Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jordan saw the panic in her eyes, and for the first time during this whole ordeal, he realized she was afraid. Not of him, not of the police. She was afraid of Marcus Carter, because she had lost control of the situation. Doyle cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I think we should check the surveillance cameras. Blake turned to him, his eyes flashing with irritation, but he couldn't dismiss the suggestion. He knew Marcus wouldn't leave without answers. Marcus no longer looked at Blake. He turned to Jordan, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Are you okay? He asked, his voice low and gentle, yet full of concern. Jordan swallowed, then nodded. Yes, Dad, he said, feeling a slight relief for the first time all afternoon. But he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Not until the truth was revealed. The atmosphere inside Westworth Jewelers became thick, as if the entire space had been stretched to the point where it could snap at any moment. The silence wasn't a sign of stability, but a forewarning of the storm to come. Everyone in the room could sense the shift in the balance of power, but no one dared to speak. No one knew what would happen next. Marcus Carter still stood there, his sharp eyes scanning each face in the store. When he pulled out his military ID from his pocket and held it up, reflecting the bright lights of the store, an invisible shock seemed to ripple across the room. Blake blinked, his jaw tightening instinctively, but there was clearly hesitation in his stance. Doyle, the younger officer standing next to him, couldn't hide his surprised expression. Not everyone gets the chance to face a Navy SEAL commander, a man who had led top-secret missions, someone with power and influence far beyond what the two officers could imagine. Then, with a chilling calmness, Marcus Carter spoke. Take the cuffs off my son, now, immediately. There was no shouting, no panic, but each word was uttered like an ultimatum, carrying weight that even Blake couldn't easily ignore. It wasn't a request, it wasn't a negotiation. It was an order. No one in the store spoke. Everyone stood still, holding their breath, waiting. They knew that this moment could decide everything. Jordan couldn't take his eyes off his father. He had never seen him in a situation like this, but there was one thing he always knew. His father never backed down, never yielded to injustice. Blake still held tightly to the cuffs, but his arm was no longer as firm as before. He stood there, as if weighing whether or not to comply with Marcus's words, But in reality, he knew he had lost control of this situation. Margaret Whitmore, who had once held full control over this narrative, now stood frozen behind the counter, her lips pressed together, her eyes completely subdued under Marcus's gaze. She was used to being the one giving orders, but now she was no longer the one in power. "Sergeant Blake." Marcus's voice didn't change, but this time Blake's name was spoken with a weight that couldn't be ignored. "Do you have any evidence?" Blake blinked, but didn't immediately respond. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his eyes never leaving him. "Let me ask again. Have you reviewed the security cameras? Do you have any witnesses who can confirm that my son committed a crime?" This time, Blake couldn't remain silent. "We received a call reporting a theft," he said, his voice no longer as sharp, but still attempting to maintain authority. "Our main witness is the store manager." Marcus slowly turned his head, his gaze locking onto Margaret. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice calm but carrying an invisible pressure, "can you confirm, in front of everyone here, that you saw my son steal?" Margaret swallowed hard, her hands involuntarily balling into fists, as if searching for a reason, an excuse, a justification to avoid facing the truth. But the problem was, she had nothing to hold on to, because Jordan had never touched the bracelet, never exhibited any suspicious behavior, and Margaret knew that. A second of silence stretched, but within that silence lay the collapse of the story she had tried to create. Blake realized it. Doyle realized it. Every customer in the store realized it. Marcus didn't take his eyes off Margaret. He didn't need to threaten. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply stood there, forcing her to face her own words. Margaret took a deep breath, then tried to steady her voice. I thought I saw him acting suspicious," she said. But this time, her voice lacked the certainty it had before. "He dropped the bracelet," Margaret continued, but now she couldn't look anyone in the eye. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Did you see him put it in his pocket?" Margaret fell silent. "Do you have any evidence that he was trying to take it?" No response. Marcus slowly nodded, as if he had anticipated this reaction. Then he turned back to Blake. "Sergeant Blake," he said, this time his voice lower but no less dangerous. "You're about to arrest my son without any evidence. Do you know what that means?" Blake clenched his jaw, but this time he didn't say anything. Doyle, who had been silently observing the whole time, slowly stepped forward, as if he had decided that he couldn't stand by any longer. "We need to see the surveillance footage," Doyle spoke up, breaking the heavy tension in the room. Marcus nodded, as if this was exactly what he had been expecting all along. "Exactly," he said, his tone not a suggestion, but an order. No one objected. A store employee quickly went to the management room to retrieve the security footage. Blake stepped back, his face stiff, as he realized that he no longer had control of the situation. Margaret, who just moments ago had been shouting with authority, now stood motionless, as if she had finally realized the real nightmare she was facing. Jordan let out a quiet breath, but he knew that things were not over yet, because the truth was about to be revealed. Blake paused, his hand still gripping the handcuff, but the certainty in his demeanor began to waver. For the first time since entering the store, he was no longer the one in absolute control. Doyle stood beside him, taking a deep breath, clearly reconsidering everything. He was no longer just a police officer following orders, but now facing a situation far beyond ordinary cases. Marcus remained steady, not a hint of hesitation in his voice. He did not raise his voice, nor did he need to threaten, but his authority made it impossible for anyone in the room to ignore him. "Mr. Blake," his voice was steady, yet sharp like a well-honed blade, "if you lay a hand on my son without evidence, I'll ensure you no longer wear that uniform for much longer." The words were not an empty threat. It was a declaration, an undeniable truth. Each word was like a bullet aimed squarely at Blake's pride, but at the same time, it awakened a deep fear he could not dismiss. Doyle glanced at Blake as if waiting to see how he would react. A long silence followed, and then, as if realizing he had been standing at the edge of a precipice without realizing it, Blake ground his teeth but slowly lowered his hand. The handcuff in his grasp was still not put away, but it was no longer a threat. Jordan stared at the man who had almost arrested him without evidence, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. His father had spoken for him. Marcus kept his gaze fixed on Blake, his stare so sharp it could pierce through any justification Blake might come up with. "I don't know what kind of actions you're accustomed to," he said, each word carefully controlled, "but I assure you today will not be one of those days where you can do so without consequence." Blake clenched his lips, the tension in him becoming more evident. He had been the one in control in many situations like this, situations where an accused person had no one to stand up for them, no one to challenge his authority. But today was not one of those days. Doyle, who had been silently observing from the beginning, finally took a step forward, breaking his silence for the first time. "We should check the security footage," he said, his voice calm but firm. Blake turned to look at Doyle, his eyes flashing with frustration, but he knew he couldn't refuse the request. Refusing to check the evidence now would be like admitting they were trying to pin a crime on Jordan without any legitimate reason. Reluctantly, Blake took a deep breath and nodded at the store employee. "Get the footage," he said, his voice stiff, but no longer as certain as before. Margaret, who had been standing behind the counter, had a moment of near panic. She looked from Blake to Marcus, then to Doyle, and back to the store employee, as if trying to find a way out. "There's no need," she said quickly, attempting to control the situation in the only way she could think of. "I saw him act suspiciously, and I think we should trust our instincts." Marcus turned around, his eyes darkening as if he had just heard something incredibly absurd. "Instinct?" He smirked, his voice low but deadly. "You're saying you're willing to ruin a young man's life based on your instinct?" Margaret took a small step back, but tried to maintain her stance. "I'm just doing what's right," she said, though this time her voice lacked the confidence it had before. Marcus nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. "Then, let's see how accurate your instinct really is," he said. "Play the footage." Margaret wanted to argue, but she knew she couldn't. The store employee quickly walked into the management office and brought out a laptop, where the security footage was being uploaded. No one in the store spoke. No one laughed. No one whispered. Everyone stood still, waiting for the truth to be revealed. Blake clenched his fists. Doyle, no longer uncertain, stood tall, ready to face what he had suspected since entering the store. Jordan stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the screen, but his heart pounded in his chest. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but what he didn't know was whether the truth would actually change anything. Because he had seen it so many times before, when the truth was twisted, when the truth was ignored, when the truth became secondary to the prejudices ingrained in people's minds. Marcus stood beside his son, his eyes never leaving the screen, But he wasn't just waiting for the footage. He was waiting for justice, something he knew had to be fought for because it never came easily. The screen flickered. The footage started to play, and the entire undeniable truth was about to be revealed. The light from the laptop screen reflected on the faces holding their breath in anticipation. Everyone in the store, the customers, the staff, and even the 2 police officers had their eyes fixed on the video playing. The images passed slowly, each frame capturing the harsh and undeniable truth. Jordan walked into the store, his gaze focused on the ring he had saved up for so long to buy. He spoke to Margaret, polite, with no sign of anxiety or suspicious behavior. He took money from his wallet, proving that he could afford to pay. Then, the next image made the atmosphere in the store feel as though it had frozen. The silver ring slipped from Jordan's hand. He tried to catch it, but he was too late. It fell onto the counter and rolled onto the floor, making a resonant sound that everyone in the store had heard. He bent down to pick it up, but before he could do so, Margaret screamed. The footage continued, with no moment showing Jordan trying to hide the ring in his pocket or doing anything that could be considered theft. Everything was completely contrary to what Margaret had claimed. The store fell into an eerie silence. Margaret was pale, her eyes glued to the screen as if, by staring harder, she might find some detail that would help her escape this situation. But there was nothing. No image in the footage could support her accusation. Blake clenched his lips, his jaw tightening so much that the muscles in his face were visible. He didn't say anything, but everyone could see that he knew he was wrong. Doyle, who had hesitated from the start, exhaled softly. He wasn't surprised, but it was clear that he felt relief knowing his instincts had been right. Jordan stared at the screen, anger and bitterness rising in his chest. He had known from the start that he hadn't done anything wrong, but proving his innocence had never been easy. He turned to look at Margaret. She avoided his gaze, as if, by not looking at him, she could deny the truth before her eyes. Marcus stood tall, but this time his gaze was no longer a warning, but an absolute certainty. He had known the outcome from the start, but he needed the whole world to see it. A moment of silence passed until Marcus spoke slowly, but sharply. "So, Sergeant Blake," he said, each word cutting through the suffocating silence of the room. "Do you still want to arrest my son?" Blake didn't answer right away. He stood there, struggling with his own pride. Having been a police officer for many years, he was used to giving orders, controlling the situation, not being challenged. But this time, everything was out of his hands. After a long pause, Blake clenched his fist and fastened the handcuffs to his belt. "There's not enough evidence to make an arrest," he said, his voice as hard as stone. But everyone knew it wasn't his decision. It was the unavoidable conclusion. Jordan gave a faint smile, but it wasn't a victorious one. It was the smile of someone who had long been familiar with this script, someone who knew that no matter how much truth was revealed, this could happen again. Margaret stood still, her face as stiff as wax. She knew there was no way left to defend herself. Marcus didn't look at Blake any longer. He turned to Margaret, his gaze sharp enough that she instinctively took a small step back. "Mrs. Whitmore," his voice was cold as steel, "would you care to explain why you made up this whole story?" Margaret swallowed, then shook her head. I only did what I thought was right," she said, but this time her voice was clearly trembling. "What you thought was right?" Marcus sneered, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "You thought a black boy couldn't walk into your store without intending to steal." Margaret didn't answer. No more words were needed. Everyone in the store had seen the truth. Doyle took a deep breath and took a step forward. "I think it's time we file an official report on this matter," he said, his voice professional, but laced with obvious disappointment. Blake didn't object. He knew he no longer had authority in this situation. Margaret still stood there, trapped in the collapse of the very story she had created. Marcus turned back to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder as a gesture of reassurance. "Let's go," he said. Jordan nodded, but as he turned to leave, he paused for a moment. He looked directly at Margaret, who had tried to use her power to destroy him, but in the end had only harmed herself. "I just wanted to buy a gift for my sister," Jordan said, his voice calm but sharp. "But I guess I learned a much bigger lesson." Margaret didn't dare look him in the eye. Jordan didn't wait for an apology because he knew it wouldn't come. People like Margaret never believed they were wrong. They only feared being caught. He stepped through the glass door of the store, the weight still lingering on him, but at least he walked out with the freedom that he had almost lost. Inside the store, Margaret still stood motionless, Blake and Doyle beginning to write up the report, while the customers, who had once looked at him with suspicion, now stood in silence, realizing that they had been wrong, but not knowing what to do with their own shame. Marcus opened the car door, waiting for his son to get in, then climbed into the driver's seat. Jordan looked toward the store through the car window, then shook his head slightly. Justice had won today, but he knew the battle was far from over. Marcus had not left the store yet. He stood tall, his gaze sharp as if he could see right through the soul of anyone in the room. When he turned to Margaret, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, as though every eye in the store was fixed on her, waiting for her to justify her actions, even though everyone knew there was nothing left to defend. "Why did you call the police?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but carrying an invisible pressure, each word piercing directly into Margaret's pride. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. There were no more stories to fabricate, no excuse to offer. The sharp words and haughty attitude from earlier had dissipated. Margaret no longer had the power to manipulate the situation because the evidence spoke for itself. Jordan watched her, a familiar bitterness rising within him. This wasn't the first time he had witnessed this. A person who was sure they were right, who believed they had authority. But when the truth was revealed, they couldn't utter a single word. Marcus didn't give her time to think or find a way to escape. He continued, his voice still as sharp as a knife. "You accused an innocent boy, fabricated that he stole, and called the police just because you thought he didn't belong here." Margaret swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure, but everyone could see she was lost. No longer was there the disdainful look, no longer the cold tone she once had. Now she was simply someone who had lost all control and didn't know what to do next. She tried to speak, but her words were cut off mid-sentence. "You just what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice not loud but full of power. "You just did the right thing? You were just protecting your store? Or you just couldn't stand seeing a black boy walk into your store with enough money to buy what you think he doesn't deserve?" The room fell into complete silence. No one dared speak, no one dared move. Everyone understood that what Marcus had just said was the truth Margaret had tried to hide. But there was no escaping it now. Jordan looked Margaret in the eye, but no longer with anger. He didn't need to be angry anymore. He had won, and Margaret knew it. She never imagined the story would go this far. She thought the police would come, cuff Jordan, and take him away without any opposition. She thought he would be blamed without anyone asking questions. But now, everything had flipped. Blake, the one who nearly arrested Jordan without any evidence, stood still, his jaw clenched but saying nothing. He knew he was wrong, but couldn't admit it publicly. Doyle, the younger officer, slowly nodded, as if he finally saw the clearest truth. Margaret never had evidence, only prejudice. Marcus didn't take his eyes off Margaret, letting the silence force her to face herself. "Maybe you're used to situations like this never being exposed," he said, each word coming out with terrifying precision. "Maybe you're used to people like my son being accused without anyone verifying it, with you creating a lie and making this whole store believe it." Margaret slightly trembled. She couldn't argue because everything Marcus said was true. "But today, you can no longer escape the consequences," Marcus continued, his voice low but firm. Jordan saw the customers in the store, those who had initially believed Margaret's accusations, now beginning to look at her differently. They no longer silently supported her. Some looked ashamed, some avoided eye contact with Jordan, but everyone knew they were wrong for believing the lie from the start. Margaret had no way out. A store employee who had remained silent up until now suddenly spoke up. "We can't keep her as manager anymore," he said quietly, but his voice was clear enough for all to hear. Margaret turned around sharply as though slapped in the face. "Wait," she tried to protest, but no one was on her side anymore. No one in the store dared defend her. No customers nodded in agreement with her. The official store manager stepped forward from behind, his tone stern. "We'll investigate this matter," he said, but there was no doubt in his voice about the outcome of the investigation. Margaret opened her mouth again, but then clamped her lips shut. She had lost. Marcus turned to Jordan and gently patted his son's shoulder. "Let's go, son," he said, his voice steady but with a certain warmth. Jordan nodded, but before leaving, he looked Margaret in the eye one last time. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to say anything anymore, because Margaret had destroyed herself, and she knew it. The glass door swung open as the two of them stepped outside. The sky was still as clear as when they had entered, but everything had changed forever. And Margaret, who had once controlled everything, was now just a shadow of herself, left behind with consequences she never saw coming. Marcus stepped out of the store, but he knew the story wasn't over yet. Justice didn't just stop at clearing his son's name. It had to be enforced, to ensure that those who abused their power wouldn't be able to continue doing so to others. As he walked outside, he pulled out his phone, his face still holding the same sternness it had when facing Blake. Without hesitation, he dialed the number of someone he knew wouldn't ignore this case, Colonel Frank O'Connell, the head of the Riverton Police Department. Only a few rings later, O'Connell's deep, gravelly voice came through, though there was a note of surprise when he saw Marcus's name on the screen. "Marcus, what's going on?" Marcus didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Frank, I just had an encounter with two of your officers, Sergeant Blake and Officer Doyle, at Westworth Jewelers. A store manager falsely accused my son of stealing with no evidence, and Blake immediately tried to arrest him without checking the facts. You can imagine what would have happened if I hadn't been there in time." There was a brief silence on the other end, then O'Connell sighed, as though he were too familiar with cases like this, but never quite able to accept them easily. "What do you want me to do?" His voice was lower now, but there was a clear seriousness to it. Marcus didn't hesitate for a second. "I want an internal investigation right away into Blake's handling of this case," he said, his tone not loud, but carrying the weight of an order, not a suggestion. "I want to know how many times he's done this to others. People who didn't have anyone to protect them." O'Connell was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was even heavier. "I understand. I'll handle it." Marcus didn't feel relieved because he knew this was just the first step. But at least this time, they couldn't ignore it, as though it had never happened. When Marcus hung up, Jordan was still standing beside him, looking at him with a thoughtful gaze. "Did they do anything, Dad?" he asked in a low voice. Marcus looked at his son, his eyes filled with a deep resolve. "Justice can't be forgotten, Jordan. If we don't fight for it, it'll be buried under lies and those with power but no morals," he said, then placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Today, we won't let that happen, and I won't let it happen to anyone else." Jordan nodded slightly. He understood that this was no longer just about him. Meanwhile, at the jewelry store, the situation had completely turned upside down. Margaret stood frozen, her face pale as though she couldn't believe she had let things go this far. An employee from the Westworth Jewelers headquarters had been called in after news of the incident spread, and it took less than 10 minutes to make a decision. She was immediately suspended pending an investigation by the management. Customers in the store avoided looking at her. Some left, while others stood in uncomfortable silence. No one saw her as someone with absolute power anymore. Now, she was left with failure and the fear of the consequences to come. Blake, who had lost all his earlier confidence, pulled out his phone. But before he could make any calls, a message appeared on his screen. "Head to headquarters. Internal investigation begins immediately." His face darkened. Blake knew his career was hanging by a thread. An accusation of discriminatory behavior could not only cost him his job, but could also destroy the entire reputation and career he had built over the years. Doyle stood beside him, clearly sensing the tension in his superior. He didn't feel any sympathy. If anything, he only felt that justice had finally spoken. At Marcus's home, only a few hours after they left the store, his phone rang again. This time, O'Connell no longer sounded hesitant. "We've officially suspended Blake during the investigation. I've also sent a request to summon Margaret Whitmore to give her statement. She won't be able to just escape this as if it never happened." Marcus nodded slightly but still didn't look completely satisfied. "Thank you, Frank, but I hope this isn't just a temporary decision. I want to see real action." O'Connell sighed. "So do I. We both know this should never have happened in the first place." Marcus didn't say anything else, but in his heart, he knew this battle wasn't over. Today, justice had won, but without continued effort, people like Blake and Margaret would continue to show up, continuing to use their power to oppress those who had no one to stand by them. He set the phone down and turned to look at Jordan, who was sitting on the chair, his gaze still thoughtful. "Justice can't be forgotten, son," he repeated, this time in a warmer tone. Jordan looked at his father, then nodded slightly. He understood that today wasn't just a personal victory, but a reminder that justice always needs to be protected at any cost. 3 days after the incident at Westworth Jewelers, Jordan stood in front of his sister's door, the small, neatly wrapped box in his hand. Though things had settled down, though Margaret had lost the power she once believed she held, and though Blake was facing an internal investigation that could end his career, what had happened that day was still fresh in his mind. The doubtful glances, the baseless accusations, the helplessness of knowing the truth wasn't enough to make people trust you from the start. He had proven his innocence, but no one should have to prove their right to exist like that. Taking a deep breath, Jordan knocked gently on the door. "Come in," Maya's voice rang out, full of excitement. He pushed the door open and saw his sister sitting cross-legged on the bed, her eyes lighting up when she saw the gift in his hands. "Is it my birthday gift?" Maya asked eagerly. Jordan smiled, but something caught in his throat. He had imagined this moment for months, a peaceful afternoon where he could proudly give the gift he had saved up for. But instead, a nightmare had unfolded before he could even do that simple thing. Still, he walked over and placed the small box into his sister's hands. "Go ahead, open it," he said. Maya quickly tore off the wrapping paper, and when she saw the shiny silver bracelet inside, her eyes widened in amazement. "Oh my God, Jordan! It's beautiful!" she exclaimed, carefully picking up the bracelet and admiring every tiny detail. "I thought it would suit you," Jordan said, his voice soft but weighed down with something more. Maya looked up, noticing something in her brother's eyes. "Is something wrong?" Jordan hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "It's nothing. I just want you to like it." Maya beamed, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "I don't just like it, I love it." Jordan hugged her back. But when he closed his eyes, the image from inside the jewelry store that day still haunted him. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he would face this. That evening, Jordan sat on the porch steps, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky. Marcus walked out of the house, holding 2 cans of soda, handing one to his son before sitting down next to him. The two of them sat in silence for a long time before Marcus spoke, his voice steady and strong, like a lighthouse amidst the storm. "You're thinking about what happened, aren't you?" Jordan nodded slightly, gripping the can of soda in his hand. "I thought that once the truth came out, I'd feel relieved." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He opened his soda, took a sip, then gently set it down on the wooden step. "Justice isn't something that happens once and is done with. It's something we have to fight for every day." Jordan turned to look at his father, his gaze reflecting the distant streetlights. "But does it ever really change, Dad?" he asked, his voice a mix of hope and doubt. Marcus looked directly into his son's eyes, his gaze unwavering. "It changes as long as there are people willing to fight for it." Jordan fell silent, but those words carved themselves into his heart. He had once thought justice was something simple, a truth told, a wrongdoer exposed, and everything would be set right. But now he understood that justice doesn't happen on its own. It must be fought for, protected, and upheld every single day. That day, all he wanted was to buy a bracelet for his sister. But he had received a lesson far more valuable than that. The story ends here, but the battle continues. Because the truth doesn't protect itself, it needs those willing to stand up for it. And Jordan knew he would always be one of those people. Today's story may have come to an end, but the lessons it brought are still with us. What would have happened if Marcus hadn't been there in time? What if there were no security cameras to prove the truth? Would Jordan have been treated fairly, or would he have become the victim of a baseless accusation? This isn't just Jordan's story. It's the story of many real people, those who have to fight every day to be seen for who they truly are. What do you think about how justice was served in this story? If you were in Jordan's shoes, what would you do to help prevent such injustices? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue following more human stories that are thought-provoking and inspiring. See you in the next story.